Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk to you today about a man called Edward Hammond, who I suspect very few of you will have heard of. It's a link to names known and unknown in our movement. Is it a unique story? Let's see. So what did we know? Well, that's just outside my kitchen window. And that is the headstone for Edward Hammond. The headstone shows that he died on the 29th of March, 1867, and pastor of this General Baptist Chapel. Just underneath is the inscription for his wife, Margaret, who died on the 24th of March, 1867, 5 days before. I knew nothing about them. I asked our historian, Sheila Krosky, what is all this about? And she knew nothing. There is nothing in the record about Edward Hammond, aside from a reference to a rather urgent need to clean the water pipes and all sorts of things just after he died. So there was a bit of guilt going on, we think. But we didn't know any more, so I wanted to know a bit more. Dr. Williams's library, Harris Manchester College, the London School of Economics, who holds some papers on him, the National Library of Wales, the London Gazette, and beyond. Between them, they hold the story. And the fun is finding them. So what do we know about Edward Hammond? Now, Edward Hammond was born on the 22nd of April, 1818, in Coggeshall in Essex. It was a textile town. Fortunes rose and dropped with textile fortunes. And a dissenting town. Loads of dissenting chapels. But he was from a strict Brethren family. Moved to London as a boy. Did attend school very briefly, but really was self-taught. Astronomy and French. But a very poor family, but self-taught. And he became a milliner. He made hats. He rejected the religion of his parents. As I say, it was a strict Brethren family he was brought up in. And he wasn't going to have anything to do with that. And he started to attend Finsbury Unitarian Chapel. Now, Finsbury Unitarian Chapel became the South Place Ethical Society around that time. And Hammond was very much part of that move in thinking that was going on there at that time. The minister at the time was William Johnson Fox, who was becoming increasingly frustrated with the Unitarian movement. I believe he had been thrown out of the Unitarian movement, but still called himself a Unitarian Christian minister. So Fox was very much taking that move away from the deeply religious and into the ethical and humanist, I think is probably the fair way to describe. Edward moved at that point. He went to Manchester with his work and started attending this place. Now that's the best photo I could find of it, I'm afraid. There's not much left of it. That's Upper Brook Street Chapel, officially registered as Chawton, but I think that's a bit confusing now. And that's where in 1845 he got married. And he married Margaret Nevison, married there in October. And he was married by the minister there, they were married, John James Tayler, E.R. And there is John James Tayler. And if you ask Dr. Waller very nicely, you can go and see the original of that picture, which is at Harris Manchester. He then came back to London. With one child at that point, they came back to London, and Edward goes back to Finsbury, to the South Place part. However, there's fun and games going on there at that point. Henry Ireson had taken over from William Johnson Fox. They were both ministers at the same time. And Henry Ireson decided that he needed to leave. The actual phrase was they were becoming fed up with the negative position as concerned Christ and Christianity. And Ireson didn't like that, and he took a large chunk of the congregation with him and moved to Carter Lane Church in London. So where there was a stronger link to religion and moving away from that ethical society approach. And Hammond went with him. He was working in Hoxton at this place at this time, and contrary to some opinion at this point, as a congregational member, as our beloved Unitarian movement allows us, began to lead services. And Hammond was taking services at Carter Lane. Carter Lane was sold, knocked down, and turned into Unity, which is Islington. And Hammond was still there then. They had 7 children at this point. They lived in a tiny house in Hoxton with a lodger and 7 children. I mean, it must have been horrendous. And that's when the London Gazette comes in, as we start to see bankruptcy notices coming through. Things were not going well for Hammond. Hammond and Smith, the milliners. And it all went horribly, horribly wrong. And the debtors' court and all sorts of things were called up. But then what happened? Well, quite strangely, Henry Ireson encouraged Edward Hammond to start to study for ministry. Now, this is a very poor man, almost no formal education, but he was encouraged to go to Manchester College, which was recorded in his obituary, and it puzzled me a little. I couldn't quite work out how on earth he'd got there. And so we did a bit of digging. There is nothing in the minute book about him. But what there is in the rough minute book, which is the other minute book that the secretary writes all the notes in during the meetings, there is reference to a letter that was sent to William Gaskell, who was chair of the committee at the time, by Henry Ireson and John James Tayler, his former minister up in Manchester, saying, please could you allow him in to attend lectures free of charge and be to attend all the courses. Extraordinary. Working closely with Sue Caloran at Harris Manchester, we can't find this happening anywhere else. Didn't check every year, but there's very little there. So we've got this very poor man is able to attend free of charge the lectures for ministers, ministry students at Manchester College at its new home in London. So quite an astonishing piece. Tayler, of course, now was principal at Manchester Community College. He'd moved down to London. So this was in 1861. Meanwhile, the Unitarian Church at Bessels Green in Sevenoaks. There was no minister at Bessels Green. The General Baptist Assembly notes makes very clear there is no minister, and it's all going to fall down, and it's awful, says the secretary, and it's terrible. They are encouraged and given a grant to get students to go and take services there. And there is a regular supply of students coming down from Manchester College down to Sevenoaks. And Edward is encouraged to attend regularly. They like him. They like him a lot. And so he starts to attend. And although he never formally, he never validates as a minister because he was never formally a student, he is called to be their minister in 1862 on a 2-year contract. And he moves into the manse cottage, which is not the manse. The manse is a 6-bedroom Georgian pile that has the widow of a previous minister living in it. Edward moves his 7 children into the 2-bedroomed manse cottage, which is attached to the meeting house. So it's a fresh start. They've got a new minister. Attendance starts to increase. They have 45 in the mornings on a Sunday, 25 in the evenings, which was very good for Bessels Green at that point. There is a decision to restart the children's chapel, which Edward and his wife lead. And that starts to bring in some numbers. He also sets up a weekday school. And then there's a few more bits and pieces that start to come his way. Give a job to a busy man. It's the only way you'll get it done. So Edward starts to attend the General Baptist Assembly. And he starts to like that, and he gets to know Joseph Calrow Means, another famous name. Now, Means and the Baptist Assembly were having a bit of an issue at this point. Joseph Calrow Means was a very Christian approach, whereas most of the General Baptist chapels were all becoming Unitarian, and he didn't like that. There's a lot more about that in the transactions. But what happened was Edward decided he wanted to be baptised, and he brought back adult baptism to Bessels Green. He reintroduced the Lord's Supper. He decided they weren't doing enough services at Bessels Green, so he started taking services across Sevenoaks. They started doing one in the town. They did one in nearby villages, and across Kent. And he started producing pamphlets. And this is where the London School of Economics comes in. The London School of Economics has copies of one of his pamphlets, which I was surprised they'd kept it, and I didn't really know why. But then checking their catalogue, they thought it was by Edward Payson Hammond, the hymn writer, and that's probably why they kept it. So I'm not going to tell them. And there was a man called John Farmer Kennard in the congregation as well, who went on to become the minister at Billingshurst, and then moved to Warren Point, where he finished his career. But he was someone that, he was just a member of the congregation, a former Wesleyan, that Edward encouraged to carry on. Now, none of this was documented in one place. It was a fascinating story. It was why bother though? Why did I decide that this was going to be worth putting some time into? You don't know, do you, why you follow these courses? It's just dusty history, really. So what was it all about? I wanted to know more about him because of that gravestone. I knew nothing more. I knew only that he and his wife died in the same week in 1867, and I knew almost nothing else. Yet the story grabbed me, and then started to scare me. Let's see what we knew. He was born on the 22nd of April. He left the religion of his parents and his regular church and became more humanist in his outlook. Frustrated, so he looked for more spiritual depth and found Unitarianism. He was married at a Unitarian chapel. He was a minister, and the minister who conducted that service and encouraged and supported his later quest for ministry. He attended Manchester College. He moved in midlife from secular employment to ministry. This must be a common story we hear now. He was encouraged as a student by the congregation and moved to Bessels Green in Sevenoaks and moved there with his wife and children. He restarted the children's chapel with his wife's support. He started to see the congregation grow. He began taking services in Kent. He became an officer of the General Baptist Assembly, and he began to get involved in the training of new ministers. Me. Me. Yeah, well, wow.
What a deadly monk.
Now, I have been at Sevenoaks for 4 years. In his 5th year, Edward died, as did his wife. And we know it was typhus, brought down by his son, who came to recuperate at Bessels Green. And it's the tick-borne disease which took them both out. Now, there is a big story now, but I know I'm going to run out of time. So, there is a big story which I've not got more slides on, and I encourage you to read. However, what you do need to know is that when Edward and his wife died, unknowns, complete unknowns in the movement, really. 7 children still in the house. After a week, his death was announced in the Inquirer. And a week later in the Inquirer, there was a little note saying that someone had sent £10 to go to the Hammond family. And the following week, there was a note that a few more people had sent some money to the Inquirer. And in early April, a group of people decided that there was quite a lot of money coming in to support these orphans. And it became known as the Hammond Orphan Fund, and it was formally set up. And running the fund were Henry Ireson, John James Tayler, James Martineau, and many others. And the fund kept going. And you go through the Inquirer, and every week there is another advert with a list of people who have given money. By June, it stood at around £2,000. This is 1867, including some money from the Reverend Henry Crosskey, whose descendant, Henry Crosskey, is within my congregation at Sevenoaks. But it went on and on and on. And the daughters eventually died. I tracked down the wills and bits and pieces. In modern day terms, they left with estates worth sort of £500,000. The money that came through that fund was just phenomenal. It is a beautiful story of how the movement can pull together and support where support is needed. It's a stunning story. It's all hidden. It's all out there. There will be a lot of stories like this around. I encourage anyone to get involved in just tracking down a little bit of history. So I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And thank you, Edward Hammond.